but we shouldn't lose track of what we should do with the existing stock. About the specific policy instruments, the first one, to develop a regulatory framework for sustainable buildings and infrastructure integration that sets clear design guidelines, building codes, incentives, monitoring and reporting. This framework to include an inventory of baseline greenhouse gas emissions from national building stocks by building type, use, climate, zone, and location. This is very important. The first question that we all ask will be, why don't we have an international agreed system on how to calculate greenhouse gas emissions in buildings? Buildings are very peculiar. Every single building is different according to its location, the use, building type, the context where it is located. But there are already some very important tools like the Common Carbon Metrics that has been developed by United Nations Environmental Program and other agencies that are putting a common language for this. So the work is ongoing. Secondly, a financing mechanism to offset initial costs and relocate total costs along the life cycle of the building. So definitely we need a push to break the static inertia that we have. We know for a fact that many buildings, especially in countries where leading technology is not available, we need an extra investment. But we know that the savings during the life cycle of the building are very important. So it's about getting together the financial institutions and our building sector together to come up with clear solutions. And another issue that came out to support policy instruments was to develop the next generation of green building certification programs based on the lessons learned and the experience of emerging eco-cities. This new generation of green building certification programs should address life cycle assessment concepts, environmental, and mostly, and I think we're missing, social issues. And finally, our commitment as a sector, first of all, to work alongside governments on policy development, to develop and facilitate market-based innovations for retrofitting existing buildings, to achieve 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in new buildings by 2020, that's very achievable, and 40% improvement of energy efficiency for existing buildings, using the current baseline of this year. Another point, another commitment will be developing a global tool or building management system to measure effectively energy, water, and waste based on life cycle assessment principles in order to facilitate the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and accounting both resident behavior and building operations. So we need definitely as well accountability and a comparable process. And finally, to dedicate funding for private and public research and development to climate neutral and net zero energy buildings. So that process is underway. So in general, I should say that we all felt strongly that we have tools, we have knowledge. There's a lot of potential in our sector. We are already moving forward, and we are showing our commitment as well to the public sector. So this mutual trust for private industry and the governments is essential. And I think we're getting to important agreements globally. So sustainable construction is definitely going mainstream. It'll be for the benefit of everyone. So we count on the support effort from everyone, all the stakeholders in the industry, to sustain their commitment to sustainable construction. It'll be really, really beneficial for everyone engaged. So it's just a matter of putting all the pieces together, building the blocks, and we'll be on the right track very soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So clearly we have a long laundry list about asks we'll be sending to the diplomats at Cancun, as well as commitments we're seeing from these 5 sectors. I'm just going to ask a few questions and then I think open it up to the floor, because I know everyone, I'm sure, given that they were part of these discussions, may have things they want to add as well. I want to ask Dennis a question, actually, something you brought up at the beginning. in terms of, you sort of were questioning this entire sectoral approach. I mean, can you go into a little more detail about why that is? I mean, you said sort of looking towards services rather than sectors. Explain that, and maybe how that might actually, or could it even actually sort of plug into sort of a UN framework?
Well, and I think it reflects what most people on the panel said here also on, of course, within the sector you can do certain things, and it's really relevant to look at it from a sector perspective. But when you look at what we actually need to provide, nutrition, for example, but that needs to be moved from one place to another. Someone needs to produce it, sell it, and process it. Energy is needed for it, and it's going to be stored somewhere. So we're all involved here, and ICT makes the whole system a bit more clever, hopefully. So I think in a number of areas, and that's also where I think sometimes with a whole issue of climate, it becomes a problem thing. It's about someone who's doing something bad and reduce that, instead of having business and also people understanding. It's about providing nutrition in a new way for 9 billion people. So I think it's about having a service sector matrix. So, okay, we work on this and see what we do within the sector by ourselves, and then we look at what society needs. And then we see how do we collaborate around those sort of pillars. So I think it's a perfect way of the UNFCCC to also say that, yes, let's adopt that kind of matrix. That's also what the sectors can do by themselves, but then focus on what society needs. And it's really about when you move away from the incremental improvements, because if we're only going to do 2%, every sector can tweak a little bit and then we reach 2%. If we talk 20, 80, 100, then we need to start looking at new ways of providing those services. So I think it's also the right time to establish such a matrix.
John and Brian, you can both answer this because we talked about this a little bit at the session last night in terms of the complexities when you're trying to deal with this. You both had sectors that are very big, very disparate, lots of different players, hard to even put them under one roof. Can you talk a little bit about how both in the groups you dealt with this, and whether there's something you can do in the future if this becomes something that becomes a bigger part of climate negotiations, how you do deal with big disparate sectors?
Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind was actually something that Dennis raised, and so it's again cross-sectoral, but the idea of not having a meeting like this, but instead having a wiki-based approach, which would allow effectively anybody that has a computer, and even the smallest of farmers out there tend to have some kind of access now because they're looking at where their markets are and they're trying to understand those. So they could very well have a voice in a dialogue that is convened that way, as opposed to convening in this more conventional way that we're accustomed to.
Yeah, I would be on the same line. I think I like the matrix idea very much, because I think, and with different time scales and in different processes, both of them can be relevant. If you look at it from inside of the sector, and you want to improve efficiency in how things are operating in there, then you can have a sector approach, and you can find ways of doing that better. From the transport point of view, when doing that, the relevant, I think, level of breakdown would be like shipping, aviation, automotive, because this would be about between companies within that subsector, within that sector like shipping, sharing best practices, doing joint R&D, or doing R&D in one company and improving how the technologies operates within that. But if we're talking about larger change, and if we're talking about transport as such, I do think that the service approach would be more relevant, because transport is done in so many ways, and what it does, it connects producers, consumers, it connects markets, delivering the service that is, and the demand for those services are driving the economy. So thereby transport is an enabler. And there are lots about modal shift, different planning, different underlying infrastructure that can then be viewed from the perspective of delivering that service in the most efficient way. So there are those two. And I think in a context like this, where we are looking towards 2050 and very big, deep reductions, that's probably more relevant to have that service approach and see transportation as such as an enabler, like ICT is. Also, ICT is transporting information, so it's almost the same kind of enabler.
Here's one follow-up. How important is it to have strong industry bodies I think the IMO or the IATA when it comes to air that can actually both help formulate these goals from an industry basis on a more specific basis, but also maybe help implement them as well? I mean, is that going to be something other industries might be able to look to have to try to play a more formalized role in this process?
But the industry bodies are crucial from the perspective of improving the efficiency within one subsector, like, for example, shipping, because there are so many specific issues in that you need to deal with it in a body like that. But what that structure cannot do by itself, at least, is to view the larger potential in designing smart transportation and logistic systems globally that would actually deliver the service needed. And they can engage, but someone needs to convene the dialogue from that different perspective. And I don't think that's not likely to come out of those organizations because they're set to look inside the sector. So someone else, like we're starting to do at this conference, need to convene the dialogue from the service perspective, actually. Okay.
Angelina, your group came up with we talked about this, very ambitious goals for the future. Can you talk to us a little bit from the work within the group? How was there anyone who was saying, wait, maybe that's not achievable, maybe we're setting the goals too high? And then also, is there ever a risk of doing that, of setting goals too high, and then if you do fall short, you risk maybe disappointment or a feeling of you going back into a feeling of inertia?
Well, no, I think the group felt very strongly that 100% is achievable, that we should, as you said, shoot for the stars, and that you should have an ambitious goal in order to be able to achieve the incremental targets even that we have right now. We have universal targets in many countries and many states of 20%, 30%, 40%. Those targets are actually being met and exceeded, depending on, again, the framework of regulations that you have. If you have the right setup, you can achieve those goals. We are very close to the technological breakthroughs. It's an issue of what do we want to invest, how much do we want to invest, how do we want to accelerate, and how do we optimize. And I just wanted to touch on what Dennis was saying a little bit as optimizing the system across the board in terms of energy. Energy is no longer only a commodity, it's a service. It's becoming very much a service industry. You're providing heating, you're providing cooling, you're providing lighting. If your appliances are super efficient, we're going down to the appliance level. You don't care if your beer is, just as cold with a super efficient and a non-efficient refrigerator. You care if your lights are bright, you don't care if it's super efficient or non-efficient lighting. As long as you're providing the service, it's there. And the jobs of the future are also connected. For instance, even with the old infrastructure, it's a challenge for the traditional utilities. There's a very good program that's actually being pioneered by New Jersey, where they're taking existing utility stock, power poles, and traffic and lights and light poles, and they're installing a solar panel on each one of those that produces electricity right into the grid. Now, solar was perfected in space. We're taking space technology, bringing it down to Earth. Microinverters were perfected in space. This is actually a NASA technology that you can wirelessly update. So you're optimizing your smart grid. You're optimizing how you transport these kilowatt hours. You're generating electricity. You're training a workforce that already maintains the old infrastructure in new technologies. So your traditional utility person now is becoming a smart grid expert, believe it or not. And the next step will be connecting to the solar systems and the distributed systems in the homes. Now, if you're driving a car of the future that ostensibly a lot of them will be powered, if not 100%, at least partially by electricity, again, IT is going to come in when do you charge that car? So you charge it off peak. How do you communicate with the other systems? So we have the technologies now. It's an issue of integrating, it's an issue of talking together, and it's an issue of making it happen. We can see it. People have said, if you dream it, you can make it happen. It's a technological issue. Just as we say, it's the economy stupid. Now with the renewable energy industry and energy, it's the technology stupid. It's a technology issue. We can solve it. And we feel confident that we're there.